Gene Tacovic is an alias used by Jimmy McGill, also known as the titular character Saul Goodman, the character portrayed by Bob Odenkirk in the TV series Better Call Saul and previously Breaking Bad. After the events of Breaking Bad, Jimmy adopts the identity of Gene Tacovic to escape his criminal past. Gene lives a low-profile life as a manager of a Cinnabon in Omaha, Nebraska, constantly haunted by the fear of being recognized and captured. In the black and white flash-forwards featured in Better Call Saul, Gene is shown living a mundane existence, struggling with paranoia and isolation. Despite his best efforts to remain hidden, he is recognized by a taxi driver named Jeff, which forces him to confront his past once again. This recognition leads to Gene almost arranging another disappearance, but ultimately deciding to fix it himself, indicating a shift in his character from constant flight to facing his problems head-on and perhaps ultimately finding some sort of redemption. With that said, and now that we have established Gene Tacovic's background, it might be helpful to examine the psyche or psychological state and evolution of the character himself. It is also worth mentioning that from this point on, there will be spoilers for Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad, so if you haven't seen these TV series, they are well worth a look. His original incarnation and the real man behind the aliases is a well-meaning but flawed individual, striving for legitimacy as a lawyer, often overshadowed and outshined by his brother Chuck and his own propensity for bending the rules. One could argue that Jimmy is decidedly more talented than Chuck, while Chuck's sense of right and wrong and outstanding work ethic have stood him in good stead throughout his career. Chuck's respect for the law is implacable, perhaps to a fault, but secretly Chuck is overcompensating and hides insecurities and a self-image of inadequacy. He too sought approval from his parents and went about it by excelling academically and professionally, whereas Jimmy, the younger sibling, saw himself as an underdog by default and so rebelled and went his own way. Saul Goodman is an alter ego that Jimmy adopts, embracing a morally ambiguous, flamboyant personality that thrives in the criminal underworld. This identity allows him to distance himself from his past failures and insecurities. Saul is a twisted and festered evolution of Jimmy and a sort of parallel character to Heisenberg. He is as inventive and in many ways as toxic as the monster that Walter White became. He is full of bravura and bravado in a way that Jimmy never was. His sense of pride even allowed him to let Kim walk out on him. Gene Tacovic, the final persona, represents a complete withdrawal from his former life. As Gene, he is cautious, paranoid, and constantly in fear of discovery and punishment. When we are introduced to Gene, he is a pathetic character with a hunted look on his face. He is withdrawn, stifled, and a mere shadow of his former self, or former selves. We see as the series progresses, though, that he begins to flag and revert back to his Saul character and eventually to finding Jimmy and perhaps redemption. The fragmented self of Jimmy's identity into Saul and later Gene indicates severe inner conflict and a deep-seated struggle with self-acceptance. Each persona reflects different coping mechanisms and survival strategies. The overarching theme of Better Call Saul and the tragedy therein is that this fragmentation shows us that Jimmy could never be his authentic self. Perhaps towards the end, when he sheds the Saul and Gene Tacovic personas, he eventually finds himself, but at a huge cost. As Gene, he exhibits acute paranoia, particularly evident in his interactions with the cab driver Jeff, who recognizes him as Saul Goodman. The paranoia manifests in hypervigilance and readiness to flee. The stress of maintaining his cover and the fear of his past catching up to him creates significant anxiety. His meticulous and cautious behavior at the Cinnabon and his interactions with the outside world highlight his state of mental distress. Throughout his life as Saul Goodman, Jimmy rationalizes his unethical and often illegal actions as necessary for survival and success. This moral flexibility is a defense mechanism against the guilt and shame he feels for his actions and their consequences on those around him. Despite his outward confidence as Saul, there are moments of vulnerability where Jimmy's inner conflict and remorse surface, particularly in his relationships with Kim Wexler and his brother Chuck. This conflict continues as Gene, where he battles the urge to flee versus the desire to confront his past. Jimmy's transformation into the Saul and Gene personas demonstrates his resilience and ability to adapt to extreme circumstances. His quick thinking and resourcefulness help him to navigate complex and dangerous situations. His decision to fix it himself rather than running away signifies a breaking point where he chooses to confront his problems rather than continue his pattern of avoidance. and this indicates a potential shift towards reclaiming some measure of control over his life. His life in Omaha is marked by profound loneliness and isolation, cut off from all meaningful relationships and living in constant fear. His existence is a stark contrast to the charismatic and socially active Saul Goodman. Despite the isolation, there are glimpses of Gene's longing for connection and normalcy, underscored by his interactions with co-workers and fleeting moments of vulnerability. However, his fear and mistrust often prevent him from forming genuine bonds. The psychological traits then of Jimmy McGill, Saul Goodman and Gene Tacovic are interconnected. Jimmy's resilience and moral ambiguity lay the foundation for Saul's strategic, morally flexible persona. In turn, Saul's unethical actions and coping mechanisms create the paranoia and isolation seen in Gene. Each identity reflects a different stage in Jimmy's psychological evolution. Jimmy McGill struggles for legitimacy and recognition. Saul Goodman embraces a morally ambiguous, flamboyant personality to survive and thrive. Gene Tacovic lives in fear and isolation, haunted by his past actions and the threat of exposure. In the final season, we see more and more black and white scenes and intercut sequences. Within these vignettes, we see Gene begin to unravel. He becomes deliberately sloppy and reckless. There is a sort of fatalism to his actions, almost hoping that some sort of inevitable catharsis will come and put him out of his current misery. It would in some ways be better than the half-life he is currently living. It is also worth mentioning the negative influence of Walter White. Walter White's influence on Jimmy, who is at this stage Saul Goodman, is profound and significantly shapes his character arc. This influence is a key factor in his descent into criminality and his ultimate downfall. Walter accelerates Saul's moral degradation and contributes to his psychological trauma and forces him into a life of fear and isolation. The complex relationship highlights the destructive power of Walter's manipulation and the far-reaching consequences of his actions on those around him. I would be remiss also at this stage if I didn't mention Saul's partner and probably best friend, Kim Wexler. She never really knew Saul and had less to do still with Gene. Her antics, however, in becoming mixed up with Jimmy and eventually Saul, have had far-reaching and devastating consequences. She was forced into exile, the very same as Saul. As she begins to see Jimmy come out of the woodwork in the form of Gene Tacovic, she also glimpses the possible and ultimately inevitable opportunity to own her own culpability and seek some form of redemption, such as it would be. One of the most powerful scenes is the one on the bus after she has finished confessing to Howard's widow. We see the raw emotional grief and shame and torrent of pain that could no longer be held back. One more thing that she felt she needed to do was to be witness and possible support to Jimmy as he faced the music and owned up to his criminal lifestyle. We must, in a sense, commend both Jimmy and Kim for finding a redemption and facing consequences that Walter White would never have allowed himself to do. Gene finally finds his way back to being Jimmy, and an honesty and authenticity that he has always craved. His previously regular regressions, Slippin' Jimmy comes to mind, into his destructive habits are, I feel, a learned helplessness stemming from probable childhood trauma and hard-to-break behavioural patterns. Despite his disingenuous tendencies, though, he has often demonstrated compassion. This is seen in his loyalty to his brother Chuck and even his employee, Yule. Gene's redemption is a complex and gradual process, marked by his struggle to reconcile his past identities as Jimmy and Saul. Through a series of decisions that reflect a growing sense of responsibility, loyalty and acceptance, Gene attempts to carve a path towards personal redemption. This journey is underscored by his shift from a life of constant evasion to one where he confronts his past and its consequences, suggesting a nuanced and ultimately hopeful arc for the character. We witnessed a scene just before Gene's arrest where he threatens Marianne. We realise that when it comes down to it, to actually hurting someone physically and directly, Jimmy or Gene just does not have it in him. He therefore once again embarks upon his habitual evasion, albeit this time in the full knowledge that it will be fruitless. He knows that his past has ultimately caught up with him. Gene Tacovic's character is a study in contrasts and psychological complexity. His journey from Jimmy McGill to Saul Goodman to Gene Tacovic reflects a profound struggle with identity, morality, and survival. Each transformation highlights different facets of his personality, shaped by his circumstances and inner conflicts. The final chapters of his story in Better Call Saul offer a poignant exploration of redemption, resilience, and the enduring impact of one's past choices. His eventual redemption is one of sacrifice and redress that offers a clean conscience and freedom from regret in his middle and old age, and that, arguably, is something we could all hope for. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for notifications. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.